The Colosseum is one of the largest and most important monuments in history. Almost 50 meters tall and more than half a kilometer in circumference, an estimated mass of 1.5 million tons. And it could be even bigger, more massive and more imposing if they hadn't destroyed half of it and spread throughout Italy. You might have never paid attention to it, but notice that the outer wall of the Colosseum is half gone, which has been the case for a while. A long time indeed, centuries. And this has to do with a very little known part of history, which is the history of the Colosseum. After the gladiators, a story about poor emperors, displaced martyrs, mining popes, and more or less innocent earthquakes, besides the various unusual uses of this monumental arena during the Middle Ages and the Modern Age. But before talking about the Colosseum's destruction, we need to cover at least the basics of its construction. And even before that, speaking of basics, let me take the moment to talk about the best basic shirt I've ever worn. Life, which is the insider shirt. An extremely comfortable shirt, practical, sweat resistant, odor resistant, no ironing needed. I pretty much just hang out with her now at home or on the street. It's really good, and if you've never used it and want to try it out, go to the Insider website through the link I'll leave in the video description and use the coupon code STRANGETOY to get 12% cash back. Discount. But going back to the basics about the Colosseum began its construction in 72 AD in the temples of Emperor Vespasian. A significant portion of the resources needed for the Colosseum's construction, came from the spoilers of the Judean-Roman War, which was when Vespasian and his son Titus suppressed the revolt there in the province of Judea, which at the time was part of the Roman Empire, and even destroyed on that occasion the Temple of Jerusalem. Tito, by the way, who led the Roman legions in this war, was the one who did the construction of the Colosseum continue after his father's death. And after that, Domitian made the last modifications. Since these three emperors make up the Flavian dynasty, Flavius was the family surname. The amphitheater they built would later be known as the Flavian Amphitheater, but back in their time it was just an amphitheater. Amphitheater, by the way, means friendliness. Simply two theaters or a double theater, just like amphibian, means two lives, one in water and another on land. In theater it's a semicircle, with stage and grandstand. An amphitheater is a circle. Everything. And why do we call this structure a Colosseum and not an amphitheater or Flavian amphitheater? Well, that's an ancient name referring to a colossus, that is, a giant statue that was near him. In this case, a statue of Nero that was later transformed into a statue of the sun god. So this name Colosseum in Latin wasn't exactly because the monument was colossal, but because it was the amphitheater for Comic-Con. Colossus, which was the point of reference. And as for what happened inside it, and this is well known, the gladiator fights, the hunts often with exotic animals brought from various parts of the empire, the public executions of people condemned under Roman law, some lighter programs like tragedy and comedy plays, and some even say there were naval battle simulations in this monument, but this is now quite questioned by historians. In any case, the Colosseum was then an arena for public spectacles. What happened on this huge stage of sand, hence the word arena, which exactly means sand, and these spectacles could be seen by more than 50,000 people. Presents, each one occupying their own place according to their social status. The emperor and the senators, of course, had the best seats, and the commoners watched the chaos a bit further away. These spectacles occurred for many. Over time, they gradually became more modest and less frequent. And this for various reasons. One that is often talked about is that Christianity, as it grew in the empire, positioned itself as opposition. And it's about the brutalities that occurred in the amphitheater. A legend even says that once during a gladiator fight, the Christian monks stormed the arena trying to break up the fight, but the audience didn't like it one bit. Little of this mattered, and the monk was stoned, and that was the last straw for the Christian emperor. Norio Bennett, battles, but as much as the Christianization of the empire might have been a factor, the issue is more complicated, because the last recorded gladiator fight in the collective, Polizeu, dates back to around 430 AD, a century after the first emperor converted to Christianity. A far more significant factor for this neglect of the Colosseum seems to have been the depopulation and abandonment, and Rome's impoverishment, linked to the empire's overall crisis, as historians Keith Hopkins and Mary Baker wrote. The Colosseum and its traditional activities were beyond what Rome's resources in the 5th century could afford. And this is where we start to understand that initial question from the video, It's like the Colosseum lost half of itself. As I mentioned in the video about the Library of Alexandria, in history, just like in physics, the trend is towards decay. If you don't do anything, time will consume. Everything requires maintenance, and this applies to the Colosseum too. Since its early years, this massive structure has needed a lot of upkeep. Constant maintenance was needed, and at times it required expensive restorations. For instance, in the year 217, the Colosseum caught fire, and it took 5 years of restoration to recover what that the fire had destroyed in a few hours, or at most in a few days. In the year 443 and in the year 508, there are also records of intense earthquakes in the area that greatly compromised the structure of the Colosseum. At the time, some restoration was even done, but there wasn't much budget for that kind of thing, and from then on the Colosseum ended up deteriorating. In a new phase of its history, the amphitheater was gradually abandoned and neglected, just like the city of Rome itself. As I mentioned, the last gladiator fight there happened around 430, and the last show, which was a hunt, took place in 522. And meanwhile, the Colosseum had already started being used for a very different purpose than originally intended. It had begun to be used as a quarry. Instead of carrying stones there to refurbish the amphitheater, people began to take stones from there to refurbish their own homes, the city walls, and do other public works. And after the activities of the Colosseum finally ceased, it began to be used in various other ways. And this was already in the Middle Ages. Houses were built within it, businesses, courtyards, blacksmiths, shoemakers, bricklayers' offices, and in many cases these internal constructions were made using the external material itself. From the old amphitheater, which now was more like a village than really an amphitheater. In the 12th century, the Frangipani, who were a powerful family there in Rome, they turned this village into a fortress, which was later taken over by another family, the Anibaldi, who in turn, a few years later, sold part of the territory. Land for a Catholic order, the Order of Saint Salvador, which was centuries passed by there. During that period, the Colosseum was so altered that the medieval people could hardly remember it had once been an amphitheater. A medieval author, for example, imagined that the Colosseum had been the palace of Vespasian, and a text from around the year 1000 said that the Colosseum had been a temple. For instance, he states the following: the Colosseum was the temple of the sun of marvelous greatness and beauty, equipped with several vaulted chambers, and all of them covered by a golden bronze sky where thunder and lightning and bright fires were made, and where the rain was poured through silver pipes. There was another legend even more unusual, that the Colosseum had been built by the poet Virgil with the use of forbidden magics and the help of demons. And finally, another medieval version says that the Colosseum had been a temple of Jupiter, that Pope Sylvester in the 4th century would have to destroyed, hence the ruinous appearance it already had in the Middle Ages. But of course that's not why the Colosseum was in ruins. Over all these centuries, the owners of the Colosseum, the last emperors, the powerful families, and the popes, all of them negotiated endless permissions to take stones from there. You think to ruin my collection, to remove stones from the Colosseum? Just to give you an idea, in 1452, later, Pope Nicholas V authorized 2,522 shipments of stone from the Colosseum to turn those stones into broth, and used it in the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. And this is where we start to move into the next part of this mystery of the lost half of the Colosseum, that is, where to find it. Before those 2,522 shipments from Pope Nicholas, something decisive happened for the Colosseum to be left half done. In 1342, an earthquake struck the city of Rome, and from it knocked down the entire southern part of the Colosseum, or at least the outer wall, which is precisely what's missing today. But you can't blame just the earthquake for that. This article popping up here, extremely detailed about the Colosseum structure throughout history. He concludes that, quote, the damages that the monument has suffered throughout its nearly 17 centuries of existence cannot be attributed just to, and especially not just to, earthquakes. Instead, much of the severe damage to the Colosseum resulted from the intentional demolition of many of its structures to reuse the precious materials it was made of. I mean, the original Colosseum structure was strong enough to withstand earthquakes. It was until they began to dismantle this structure. It's like that game of removing pieces from the tower. At first you can remove 1 piece, 2, 3, but eventually the structure becomes so compromised It's like removing just one more piece, or even just a gust of wind and the tower collapses. In the case of the Colosseum, that gust was an earthquake, which also helps. To get in the way, in 1349, half of the tower, so to speak, the lost half of the Colosseum, it fell. But okay, and where did those little pieces end up? So, as I've already hinted, one of those places was St. Peter's Basilica and other structures of the Vatican complex, which also used limestone taken from various other ancient monuments, like one of the two Roman pyramids, the Pyramid of Romulus, which is a topic I've already touched on in another video channel. The material from the Colosseum was also used in the renovation of several other basilicas at the time, like the old Basilica of St. John Lateran and the construction of various Renaissance palaces such as the Farnese Palace, the Senatorial Palace and the Barberini Palace. This last one, the Palazzo Barberini, received material from the Colosseum directly from Pope Urban XVIII, who was from the family Maffeo Barberini, the very one from Galileo's condemnation. By the way, the Barberinis squandered so many ancient Roman monuments that a critic of the time wrote the following: "The barbarians did not do it, the Barberini did. What the barbarians did not do, the Barberini did." So it's mainly in those works around the time of the Renaissance, around the 14th century to the mid-17th century, we can find most of what we no longer see today. Colosseum. Now there is only one last thing left to talk about. Why is the Colosseum still half standing? Why haven't they dismantled it completely? Interestingly, the popes also have a role in preservation in this story. During the Renaissance, with the recovery, translation and study of ancient texts, Greco-Roman mainly, the memory of what the Colosseum really had been in antiquity, an amphitheater, was finally recovered. And how were Christians executed in amphitheaters in ancient Rome times? The Colosseum began to be seen by many as a sacred space where the martyrs gave their ultimate testimony of faith. In reality, no ancient document mentions Christians being executed collectively. Colosseum. There are records of executions in other amphitheaters, but none in the Colosseum. One of the main expressions of this is an inscription by Pope Benedict of Rome placed in the Colosseum in 1750 that reads as follows: "Next, the Flavian amphitheater, famous for its triumphs and spectacles dedicated to the pagan gods in their worship. Impius was redeemed from this unclean curse by the blood of the martyrs. That same Easter banned the use of the Colosseum as a stonemason and erected stations of the cross in the arena, thereby converting in a way this pagan amphitheater at a Christian worship site. In the same spirit, several other popes after him made important reforms to the monument, strengthening its structure, installing external and internal pillars, and returning, so to speak. Some pieces had been removed, and then in the 19th century the state finally took over the role of caring for the monument, which imposed, so to speak, what the Christians did there throughout the century, and began archaeological excavations to recover the history of the ancient Flavian amphitheater. But here's a bit of irony, because in this modern effort to recover the monument's history, that had already lost half of its structure, the 19th century archaeologists ended up destroying half or even more than half of the monument's history, or at least destroying the materiality that would allow us to rebuild this history more accurately. Everything I've told you here about the story of the Colosseum beyond antiquity is also history. I also have a medieval, modern, contemporary story, and in the eagerness to recover just the ancient history, the others were almost left behind, and that completely destroyed it. Left over? One or two pieces enough for the historians I referenced for this video to be able to say one or two something about this post-ancient history of the Colosseum, but it's a very fragmented, wholly dilapidated story.